I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast. We invite you to do so simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. In this episode, my guest is award-winning author, essayist, and journalist Adam Hochschild. Co-founder of Mother Jones Magazine, he's a graduate of Harvard and an instructor in the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. He's published numerous articles in leading newspapers and magazines and is the author of many books, including Halfway Home, To End All Wars, King Leopold's Ghost, Bury the Chains, Rebel Cinderella, and most recently, American Midnight, selected as one of this year's best nonfiction books by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the New Yorker, and the New York Post. And I welcome Adam Hochschild to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. Good to be with you again.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, 2 years ago, I was with you and Arlie, your wife, talking about many things on stage at a KQED event, which people can see online. And we started off talking about Ukraine, which was weighing very heavily at the time. And I thought maybe with all of your connection to Russia and Ukraine, we can talk about Ukraine now. I mean, there are some recent events that really bear scrutiny, particularly Assad's fleeing to Russia and takeover by HTS, but also North Korean troops and an assassination of a major general. I mean, how do we put all this together in terms of when will this brutality and horror end? How do you see it?
Well, I'm not sure I've got an answer to that, but I do think about and read about Ukraine obsessively. The Ukraine war is the first war in my lifetime where I have been a complete hawk. When it came to U.S. wars in Vietnam, Central America, Iraq, so I was always on the protesters' side. But Ukraine is the victim here. There was absolutely no excuse for Putin's very brutal invasion of Ukraine, seizure of a good part of its territory, and brutal, nasty treatment of people there. I really worry for Ukraine now because, as we all know, in the past, Donald Trump has been extremely friendly with Vladimir Putin. He's also repeatedly said he doesn't want the United States to get involved in wars overseas. And while I generally think that's a good thing, and would have been a great thing when it came to Central America and Iraq and Vietnam, I do think defending Ukraine or helping Ukraine defend itself as being in the same moral category of helping the countries that were attacked by the Nazis in World War II. And so I am really worried about what's going to happen to Ukraine now. I'm glad to see Russia lose some interest in Syria, lose some influence in Syria. I was fascinated to see that the Ukrainians loaned the Syrian rebel forces some drones and some drone operators because they wanted to inflict a blow on Putin there. And I'm certainly very glad the Assad regime got overthrown, but I'm afraid that just frees up Putin to use even more force against the Ukrainians. And I really worry for them right now.
Well, we're on the same page here. I mean, I feel their sovereignty was violated. I feel, they're the good guys in all this. But I wonder what you make of Stephen Cohen's arguments, a Princeton professor who died a couple of years ago of lung cancer, and who was the husband of Katrina vanden Heuvel, who ran The Nation magazine, and a progressive thinking, I guess leftist really, is his politics. And he felt that Putin was being demonized to a great degree. And he felt that, there was hegemony and unilateralism on the part of the West that Putin was vying with and struggling with, and that he was, how shall I put this, that he was not the bad guy, really, that NATO was offering incursions on Russia that they had to stand up against. Just wonder how you respond to that argument.
I've heard that argument, but I emphatically don't agree with it. The argument runs, Russia would not be doing any of this stuff, incursions in Ukraine and so on, if NATO had not expanded to invite in the countries of Eastern Europe.
That is the argument, exactly, yeah.
The Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, and so forth. However, looking at history and I'm talking not just about history of the Soviet period, but history of Tsarist Russia as well. If I were a citizen of any country in Eastern Europe, whether it was Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, whatever, I would be terrified of the Russians because, Tsarist Russia included much of what is now Poland, most of what is now the Baltic states. The Soviets in 1939, when they divided Eastern Europe between themselves and Hitler, again seized half of Poland, seized the Baltic states. So there is a long history of Russia under several different kinds of regimes, feeling that it has a right to help itself to those portions of Eastern Europe that were once part of the Tsar's empire. When it comes to Ukraine, the Russians feel so even more because, of course, Ukraine in Soviet days was part of the Soviet Union. And Putin mourns the fact that the way things were set up, there were 15 separate republics, which then became separate countries when the Soviet Union quite unexpectedly completely dissolved. But I don't think that provides any excuse for this immensely brutal war, especially since the time of that peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine has really been more or less a democracy. Sometimes a corrupt one, sometimes with oligarchs having undue influence, but they've had elections. They have a relatively free press. They model themselves more on Western Europe than on the old Russian Empire under any of its forms, whereas Russia has become increasingly more repressive, jailing any critics, journalists, assassinating its enemies overseas. So I really don't have any sympathy for the Stephen Cohen argument.
Well, Putin has been at least aspiring to try to be a new czar. He said the biggest tragedy of the 20th century was what you just alluded to, the breakup of the Soviet Union. And echoing what you're saying, Timothy Snyder, the Yale historian, has said on a number of occasions that what's happening in Russia is very comparable to the fascism and Nazism in the 1930s. But when Putin actually struck Ukraine and invaded Ukraine, he said they have Nazis and there are Nazis there. And I don't even understand the viability of that argument or where it comes from. Do you?
Well, there was something of a far-right movement in Ukraine.
Still is, actually. Yeah.
It still is, and people who parade around with swastikas and so forth. But if you look at the last election in Ukraine, they got less than 3% of the vote. Whereas all over Western Europe, these neo-Nazi parties got a much larger percentage of the vote, and the Ukrainians elected a Jewish president. This, to me, is not a Nazi country.
Well, I remember when I was talking to you and Arlie, we were making comparisons not only to Putin aspiring to be a czar, but maybe aspiring to be like Stalin. And Arlie very, I think, perceptively said, he's like a stone. There's a sense of his being removed from kind of what we think of as general human empathy, isn't there?
Absolutely. And he is, of course, obsessed with restoring the old empire. I think it was very hard for anybody who was high in the old Soviet regime to see it dissolve in 1991, because up until the end of 1991, the Soviet Union was one of the world's two superpowers. It had more people than the United States because it had all those, 15 constituent republics. And then suddenly, boom, it's 15 separate countries. Russia as a country has an economy smaller than that of Texas, smaller than that of Italy. And this was deeply humiliating for these guys who to go from being a superpower to being a quite small, economically rather weak country. It was deeply humiliating, and so they dream about restoring the old empire, and the empire as it was both in Soviet and Tsarist days.
Well, they have the nukes to presumably
They do
bring that into some kind of fruition, or at least horror or catastrophe. I wonder what you think about Tulsi Gabbard being named head of intelligence by Donald Trump, who not only liked and cottoned up to maybe even much more than Trump, Putin, but also Assad.
I am horrified, and I sure hope that she fails to get confirmed by the Senate.
And RFK Jr., same feelings or not?
Same feelings. Well, Kennedy is sort of an interesting case because there's some of what he says that makes sense, treat conditions like obesity, not with high-priced drugs, but with diet, lifestyle, getting more exercise, and so forth. He says many things that are hostile to the big food industry. They're putting unnecessary chemicals and preservatives.
He was also a major environmental lawyer. He has a track record.
That's right. Did a lot to protect the Hudson River in New York. At the same time, this animosity to vaccines, I think, is absolutely crazy. It's absolutely contrary to what, 95% of doctors say. And I fear that on the first set of things, trying to get big food in this country to behave differently, he's never going to get anywhere. Because if he starts trying to regulate what they can and can't put in processed food, for example, the heads of these companies are just going to go to their fellow billionaire Donald Trump and say, call him off. But with the vaccines, I fear he could have much more effect. But I think he, too, may run into confirmation troubles in the Senate. Already, Mitch McConnell, who's himself far from being one of my favorite people, but is a polio survivor, has spoken up about the importance of vaccines when it comes to polio.
It's fascinating to watch all this unfold, but it's also a bit frightening in many ways. And I'm wondering, since I remember that memorable conversation I had with you and Arlie a couple years back, you were pretty hopeful at the time, particularly about, what we could broadly label progressive politics, but movement toward, you have a son on the Energy Commission and things look better here in California in terms of environmental strides. Now, how do things look to you?
Not so good. I think they still look pretty good for California. My son David is still head of the California State Energy Commission, and California, which is the world's fifth largest economy, is making amazing strides towards switching our energy production to renewable sources. The bulk of electrical energy produced in California today comes from renewables. And
Can I just
increasing.
interrupt you for a second? I want to get back to your thoughts on this, but we did a number of interviews with people from the Stanford Lane Center of the West, including Felicity Beringer, and she said California is a tortoise. They're all tortoises. They're all slower tortoises, but California is still a tortoise. Your response?
Well, I think she's right because we know how severe the climate change problem is. We know it's getting worse, and we know that no country, no state is moving fast enough to do the turnaround that we have to do. I saw a shocking illustration of this just a couple of days ago. We were driving across the Bay Bridge from Oakland to San Francisco. And when you get on the bridge in Oakland, you go through the toll plaza, there's a place where the bay is right up against the edge of the road. Well, it was over the road. The right-hand couple of lanes had somewhere between a foot to 2 feet of water in them. I've never seen that before in my life. It was a combination of a windy day and a high tide making this surge. This wouldn't have happened years ago. And I think, yes, we're making some strides on energy, but nowhere in the world is that happening fast enough. But now we've got a president who doesn't want it to happen at all.
Well, and who allegedly doesn't even believe in climate change.
Right. Do we know if Elon Musk believes in climate change?
Well, he did supposedly say some things along the lines of constructive concerns when Tesla was being promoted, shall we say. This is something he said he was doing for the environment and spoke up like that. I mean, he was at that time of a different political stripe, or appeared to be, before
But do we know if he cares how the electricity for his cars is manufactured?
I have no idea if he cares about that, but he ought to, certainly,
He sure
because
should.
there are more concerns there maybe than there are about some of the other matters of the environment.
Absolutely.
So you're not obviously quite nearly as optimistic as you were 2 years ago. And how does that pessimism translate?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, 2 years ago, remember, we had just had the midterm elections where the Democrats actually did fairly well.
Yeah.
And we were all thinking, a lot of us were thinking, well, this means, we do okay in 2024. Then Biden, who should have dropped out way, way earlier, hung on to the last minute, had the disastrous debate, finally did drop out. Kamala Harris, I think, ran a pretty decent campaign, but couldn't escape being tied to Biden and his increasing unpopularity. And now I'm worried on many counts. In recent weeks, Trump has made clear he's going to come after critical media. He's already filed lawsuits. He filed a suit against ABC for something George Stephanopoulos said. And ABC settled with him for $15 million. And a lawyer friend of mine who knows this area of the law very well says that was ridiculous. They didn't have to settle. They could have won in court. But they, like Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and many others, seem to be in the process of kissing the ring right now and trying to get on Trump's good side. And Trump also sued a newspaper in Iowa that published a poll he didn't like. He'll sue more people. He'll try to sick his prosecutors on them. So I'm very worried about what's happening with the media. And that's just a part of it. Then we have Ukraine, which I'm sure he's going to try to make some deal with Putin. His version of settling the Ukraine war is to give Putin everything he wants, or most of what he wants. I fear he will pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement on climate change. Again, not that that agreement had much teeth in it, but at least it was a formal recognition that we have to work together to solve this problem. And the list could go on.
What do you make of these businesses kissing the ring, as you put it? I mean, Silicon Valley titans, and not only that, but there seems to be less concern about DEI and things of that nature. They're kind of moving in a totally different direction.
They are. I think, of course, it is so advantageous if you're head of a major corporation to have good relationships with whoever is in the White House. It's, these people feel, well, we have to do business with the government. We have to have a line of communication open. And so they do their kissing the ring. And I find it appalling, disgusting, dismaying.
But how do you really feel, as they say?
Not good. And just, I feel disappointed in the lack of moral fiber that these people are showing. Jeff Bezos and also the guy who owns the Los Angeles Times, both didn't allow their papers to run the editorials that apparently had already been written endorsing Harris. You would think, Bezos, a guy who has such a huge empire, would have more spine.
So what does all this mean for someone like you who has been a very gifted and responsive person of great concern and activism with respect to human rights and social justice?
Well, I'm not worried about myself. I don't think I'm important enough for Trump or anybody else to come after. I also feel some safety living in the state of California in a way that I wouldn't if I were living in in Texas or Mississippi or somewhere. I don't think I or my friends or my wife who also do this kind of stuff are important enough to get the White House to pay attention to us. So I'm not worried for myself, but I'm worried for what effect this has on the country, for what effect it's going to have on curricula in the schools, for the way it's going to embolden people in states like Florida, Texas, and so forth to go after what can be taught in the schools, to go after what books can be available in public libraries. This is already happening on a large scale.
And I remember, again, when we spoke a couple of years ago, you quoted someone whom we both admired and were friends with, Todd Gitlin, who unfortunately had passed away recently when we had the opportunity to speak, who was saying that the right is going after school boards and city councils and the left is going after in English departments. And I kind of laughed at that, but there's, in my finding it funny, there's also something very sad in that because there's a truth in it.
There is. I think the left in this country has never been very good about systematically, patiently, in a long-term way, organizing on the local level. Because you really do have to go after the school board. You do have to go after the city council. You do have to get good people into politics, starting at that level. The right is much more organized about it. I think it's perhaps easier to do when you have a very clear view of the world in the way that the right wing does, that big government is bad. And if that's your kind of basic organizing principle, and it's also, you can organize people around it, they also have vast amounts of funding. People like Karl Rove have been in the business for a long time of scouting out candidates at the state and local level, getting them started running for positions there so that they can then run for nationally. The Democratic Party is tremendously disorganized, and I fear always will be because it's such a collection of people of many different tendencies. Ranging from Bernie Sanders on the left to, people who are at times almost indistinguishable from Republicans over on the right. So things are not in a good way.
Any idea of how we can come out of this? Actually, I saw something just this morning that gave me pause. I think it was Larry O'Donnell who said with the fight that's going on over the budget, Trump may have 4 years of being a lame duck president. To some extent, he's got a lot of Republicans rebelling against this idea that Elon Musk has put forward that the budget should just be kind of junked.
Yeah, I think that I look forward to seeing all these right-wingers fighting among themselves. And in a way, it's starting to happen. The fact that 38 Republican members of Congress did not go along with Musk's demand on the budget bill was interesting, and I think that showed, well, maybe they don't have to march completely in line with everything that Musk and Trump say. I think it'll be very interesting after January 20th to see which nominees get confirmed and which don't. Confirming nominees for cabinet posts and other positions has usually been a sort of routine matter. But I think Trump nominated some of these really outrageous types, starting with Matt Gaetz for the Justice Department, almost to sort of test what he could get away with. And I hope that some senators will have enough spine, and it doesn't take very many of them. It just takes, I believe it's the margins. If you have 4 Republican senators voting against somebody, along with all the Democrats, that's enough to not get them confirmed. I hope some of these senators will have enough spine to not confirm people who believe that vaccines are harmful and all this other nonsense.
When you talk about the divisions within the Republican Party, there also remain very strong divisions and polarization within the Democratic Party. In fact, one could argue maybe even more. So at least the Republican Party has a kind of cult of Trump behind it. But the Democrats seem to be looking and longing for some kind of leadership.
It's true. It's easier to be coherent as a political party if you do have a cult-like charismatic leader. The Democrats almost never have had somebody like that. And they are indeed very, very divided. My own feeling is with that of Bernie Sanders, who says, the Democrats have lost the vote of the working class in this country because they're not putting forth policies that are going to help these people. I have a friend who is a former state senator in rural Maine, and I saw him there last summer, and he said, 30 years ago, everybody in this community, this is a very rural part of the state, who works with their hands was a Democrat. Today, they're all Republicans. And I think the Democrats have not yet come up with a coherent set of policies and answers that address the growing maldistribution of wealth in this country, that address the fact that, the good portion of the American population, the lower 45% of those in income terms, have actually lost ground in terms of real wages in the last few decades. And unless you address that, these folks are easy prey for a charismatic leader like Trump, who's going to make it even worse for them with all the tax cuts for his billionaire friends, but has this magical way of saying, identify with me, vote for me, and someday you'll be a billionaire like me.
How much of this has to do, though, more than the economics with the cultural issues? I mean, transgender issue, for example, is big among the working class in terms of it being overemphasized in there, the judgment of many working people, or for that matter, the idea that the borders are not well policed enough, those kinds of issues that may in some ways even eclipse for many people in terms of their exercising their franchise as voters, their economics.
I think it does, but these have become symbolic issues that have been very effectively exploited by the right. I dare say most Americans don't have a trans person in their lives. It's not a big issue for them, but for people who feel their place in the world threatened, their economic life threatened, they're the people who feel, I'm not going to be earning as much money as my parents did. When somebody comes along and says, well, that's because immigrants are taking your jobs, or that's because the Democrats are doing all this stuff for trans people and not for you. These are kinds of things that demagogues can exploit very, very easily. I mean, the whole immigration issue is such an interesting one on that score, where you have some of the most intense anti-immigrant sentiment in parts of the country where there are no immigrants. Arlie's last book was about Eastern Kentucky, that she spent half a dozen years going back and forth to. County she studied was 99% white. There are no immigrants there because there are no jobs. People are immigrating, the young people especially, looking for jobs elsewhere. But everybody is all riled up about immigrants taking their jobs. Demagogues can accomplish a lot with that kind of thing, and we see that not just here, but in Europe as well.
They're a lot more accomplished, the Republicans are, at stirring that up, clearly, than the Democrats. In fact, you wonder what the Democrats can stir up. Abortion seemed like it would be a big issue, and you talked about the midterms. Maybe it would carry like it did with Dodd, but certainly didn't prove to be enough in this last election. And I'm wondering how you see things, again, from the perspective of your most recent book, because you're talking about America at Midnight, about a time when there was strong xenophobia, nativism, all the kinds of things that we're witnessing now, demagoguery, that you alluded to, and all of this sort of coalescing in a way that should really give us pause. It's almost as if instead of rhyming, history is repeating.
Well, we have been there before. American Midnight was about this period, and we've talked about it, 1917 to 1921, when in the 1920 presidential election, there were several candidates for both the Republican and Democratic nominations who were running on platforms of mass deportation. And I think this country goes through cycles of people resenting immigrants, refugees, newcomers. The people who resent them are those whose families have been here for a couple of generations and have usually come from other parts of the world. So right now, the resentment is directed against people coming over the southern border, mostly from Latin America, although not entirely from there. 100 years ago, the resentment was basically among Americans of Anglo and Germanic backgrounds against immigrants coming from Poland, Russia, and Italy, Jews, Poles, and Italians. So we go through cycles like this. And yes, sometimes immigration can be disruptive. I think also an important thing we mustn't forget is that the arrival of immigrants does often lower the wages of people on the lower end of the wage scale because the immigrants are desperate for work and are willing to work for less. So I do think immigration has to be regulated and limited, but I don't think it's the source of all evils.
Well, and we've also got the problem of demagoguery there as well, painting immigrants and migrants as, there's a terrible tragedy of a young woman raped and killed in Georgia, and that becomes ballooned and expanded to be somehow the work of something pervasive and those coming across the border, or there are terrorists coming over the border and so forth. That's the picture that's given.
That is the picture the Republicans paint, but of course we know very well from the statistics that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than other people, and that's logical because they don't want to be deported. So they tend to be safer drivers and more careful and commit fewer crimes. But I do think it becomes a powerful way that the Republicans and Trump in particular have used to rile up their base, to demonize people. I actually am less worried about Trump's threats to deport huge numbers of people than I am about some of the other things he may do, because I think if he deports a significant proportion of those 10 to 15 million undocumented people in this country, his billionaire pals are going to tell him, hey, you're taking away our workforce, and if we have to hire American citizens for those jobs, we're going to have to pay them more. And of course, that would never do. So I don't think there'll be huge numbers deported, but I think there'll be some made-for-television scenes of, soldiers escorting groups of people across the border or whatever to sort of satisfy the base. But he's not going to take away the workforce of his billionaire friends.
Well, it's not only the cost of labor, it's also, frankly, when you examine it, going to be an enormous expense to deport all those numbers that he's talking about in inflated, usual, exaggerated terms.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the parallels again. I mean, you immerse us brilliantly into that period, 1917 to 1921. And America, like I said, was at a time when there was also the Red Scare, and there were things that were going on that were very much geared toward a kind of paranoia that can be comparable in some ways and need to be examined from our present perch and perspective?
I think it is comparable. And I think you're right that there's some similarity between these periods. If you look at the United States in the American Midnight period, 1917 to 21, people were unsettled by a lot of things. One was the arrival of large numbers of immigrants who were changing the way cities looked. They were changing the language of the signs that were displayed on stores and so forth. And a lot of people found this unsettling. It was also a time when there was a rapid mechanization of agriculture, which meant many people were leaving farms for the cities, and they felt displaced. There are a lot of things about life on American farms as it had been going on for centuries, where the roles are clearly defined. Men and women's roles are different. But now everybody moving to the city, women were going to work in large numbers, something that increased during World War I when men were drafted into the army. Employers often found that in some jobs, the women workers were better than the men, and they wanted to keep them in these jobs after the war ended. This was very unsettling for American men. And the American divorce rate tripled between 1890 and 1920. Still low by today's standards, but it was part of this whole displacement. Then people were also deeply unsettled by the Spanish influenza epidemic, which killed hundreds of thousands of people in this country, proportionately a larger proportion of the population than died from COVID. And then came the Russian Revolution, which many people in power in the United States feared, not realistically, I think, feared might spread to this country. And that, again, became an excuse for paranoia. And many politicians found that anti-communism was a wonderful way to ride to power.
It was also a time of terrible racial upheaval. You write about Georgia, for example, and lynching there and the atrocity and horror of what happened there, but also I look back and recall during this period what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was, again, egregious and horrible beyond the imagination. In fact, I think it wasn't David Breon Davis, the Yale historian, who said this period was unmatched in U.S. history?
Yes. 1919 actually was the year of the worst racial violence in American history. Probably somewhere between 700 and 900 people were killed, almost all of them black. They don't know the accurate body count because the worst killings took place in Arkansas, where both local vigilantes and federal troops tried to suppress some sharecroppers who wanted to form a union. Many of them were killed. Their bodies were tossed in the Mississippi River and just floated downstream. No one knows how many deaths happened there.
It's also, I was thinking about Isabel Wilkerson's book and reading yours, where she talks about the Great Migration from the South. They were trying to see some of the more paranoid, let's say, those migrations as being part of an attempt to create more voters, just like they're doing now with respect to immigrants coming in from Latin America.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful book of hers, The Warmth of Other Suns, about the Great Migration. I think one of the constants in American history is this idea of the Great Replacement. Keeps popping up again and again. 100 years ago, there were black people flooding into northern cities because they were trying to get out of a region of the country, the South, where there was often an average of one or more lynchings a week somewhere in the South. So they were desperate to get out of that. They came north. They were willing to work for less money than many of the white people already there. That produced the enormous race riots that swept some 24 American cities in 1919. We shouldn't really call them race riots. These were basically attacks by white mobs on black people. And then today, again, we hear about the Great Replacement. It's all these immigrants pouring over the southern border that are taking away good American jobs and so on. And you see them. I mean, if I walk around the streets in the Bay Area, you know, anybody who's working on a construction site or fixing somebody's garden for them or repairing the sidewalk, they're all speaking Spanish because they're all coming from Latin America. And they're doing jobs that people here don't want to do.
We also see in this period, as we're seeing presently, and as you point out, the fragility of democracy, don't we?
Yeah, something that we've always taken for granted is going to be there and be firm and clear and respected by everybody. Then along come people like Trump and Musk who say quite contemptuous things about the very idea of democracy, the very idea of respecting the Constitution. Elect me again in 2028. Why not? He says these things in a sort of half-joking way, but again, it's sort of testing the boundaries. How far can I go? And I think when people are deeply frustrated, and I think a huge portion of this country's population are because they feel their economic position declining, they're willing to tolerate this.
We also learn, I think, from this period, the sense of parallel to our own period in Trump with America exceptionalism and nationalism, don't we?
Well, I think whenever you have people riled up against foreigners, against an invasion, people cling to national identity as something that gives them status, something that seems secure, something that protects them against the other. The invader is the other. And I don't know. I just feel this is not what we need for today's world. We need a sense that we're all in it together. And when the ocean levels rise, it's going to affect us all. It already is affecting us all, but of course it's affecting some parts of the world more than others. I'm waiting for the ocean to rise enough to flood Mar-a-Lago. Maybe then Trump will take things seriously, but a lot of the rest of us are going to be underwater by that point.
Well, I wondered in reading your book if maybe when Trump talks about making America great again, he's thinking about this particular period because of really hegemony of the culture that he has been pretty much standing behind and touting.
I don't know how much history Trump knows or thinks about. I would like to think he's thinking about this particular period and has read my book. But
I'm saying this with some levity, Adam. I mean,
something tells me that's not the case.
Yeah, I doubt if he's ever read the Constitution or anything, but he has great appeal and charisma. I mean, that's real.
It is real. It is real. We have to recognize that, and we have to learn how to combat it.
Well, what do you think about those people who, for whatever reason, support Trump? They think it's better for their pocketbook, I've heard many people on the right say, well, I don't admire his character, I don't admire his lying and so forth, but he helps my pocketbook, or he's good on Israel, or those kinds of arguments. I'm sure you've heard them as well. What do you say to those people who say, and look at what the left is doing. They're making me into a racist or a misogynist. I don't feel I hate women. I don't hate black people. I'm a good guy or a good woman.
Well, I think you say, okay, you've got some grievances, and they're real. And the economic grievances, I think, are especially real, as I was saying before. And then you try to talk about what are the big problems that Trump is not addressing. I think the major one is climate change, which is going to affect all of us and is already starting to do that. People in some of the reddest parts of the country have experienced the worst hurricanes and tornadoes in places that didn't used to have them before. Flooding. The radical changes in weather have affected almost everybody. I hope we can find ways to use stuff like this as a means of, as a way to talk to people.
I share your hope. I knew we'd be talking about Russia and politics, and I also wanted to talk to you about Africa, because it's something that you have been, well, I should mention that your roots are in South Africa, and you've written probably the best book that's ever been written about Congo and King Leopold and that whole history, and I know you care deeply for Africa. One of the questions I've always wanted to ask you, though, when you talk about the Congo, but they talk of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and there are so many post-colonial African nations that broke away from colonialism, and they came under different kinds of tyranny. I think about Uganda and Amin, of course, but think about the genocide in Rwanda. And I wonder how this sort of your assessment of that in the longer range question that it seems to create for us. How successful have these regimes been in breaking away from colonialism and establishing their own roots? Well,
I think it's hard to generalize about all of Africa because many countries have taken many different routes there. I most recently have been to the Congo a couple of times in recent years. And it's a disaster zone. People are worse off there, economically speaking, than they were at the end of Belgian colonialism. And in a way, it's not surprising, because here was this country that was ruthlessly exploited as a colony. First as a privately owned colony of King Leopold II of Belgium, and then as the Belgian Congo for decades and decades. Then quite abruptly, it became independent with no trained people, no educated people to administer and govern this enormous territory, as big as the United States east of the Mississippi. And then they quite rapidly acquired a dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko, who was backed wholeheartedly by the United States. We sent him over $1 billion in civilian and military aid over the years because this was the time of the Cold War, and anyone could sell themselves to the United States if they were anti-communist enough. So that's probably the part of Africa that has been the worst off since the end of colonialism. There are other places that have done much better. You look at the country of Botswana, for example, which is under a quite honest government that scores quite high on the Transparency International score. They do a quite good job of sharing their wealth with the people. Botswana discovered its great resource, diamonds, after the British, who had been the colonial power ruling the territory, left. I often wonder if the British departure would have been under very different terms if they'd discovered the diamonds before then. And the Botswana government has said to the international diamond companies, okay, if you want to come in here and mine diamonds, you have to give us a 50% share, and you have to do the job-creating processing of the diamonds here and not in Europe. So Botswana has some of the best per capita income anywhere in Africa. Some other countries have done pretty well, like Ghana, on the score of being democratic and reasonably prosperous. But much of the country is still suffering the after effects of colonialism. And I think today, the real thing that Africa is suffering is that China has taken over as the colonial power, and country after country after country coming in, making deals, building ports, railroads, infrastructure that country's leadership wants, in return for getting things like 50-year concessions to mine particular industries and to mine particular minerals and so forth. And then if you look at where the roads and railroads and so forth are actually built, an awful lot of them turn out to be built, between the capital and the leader's summer home or something like that. So there's a lot of resentment against China in Africa now. And in terms of actual investment and exploitation of the continent, I think they're at the moment ahead of the United States and Europe.
Oh, I think they're way ahead, certainly of the United States, but also, as you suggest, of Europe in terms of making inroads and establishing themselves throughout the continent. And as you say, there are countries that are very different, but I wonder sometimes if there's a feeling of frustration in just not enough democratization or not enough advancement economically or not enough, shall we say, progress in so many of these African countries. I also think about Arab states, and I don't know where Syria is going to go, but the Arab Spring had so much hope attached to it, and now we have all these despotic regimes. And I remember, probably like me, you were very hopeful when Castro came into power and Cuba was established, and now there's still all kinds of problems there. I mean, you look almost anywhere. Algeria had a revolution, and now Algeria is under a kind of tyranny. One can get terribly frustrated with the way things turn out, the denouement of many of these nations that look.
One can. I mean, I still cheer the falling of a tyranny, and I was very glad to see Assad go from Syria, and very moved to see the pictures of the people swarming into the prisons, trying to find traces of their loved ones. But I'm not optimistic that a Scandinavian-type democracy is going to take his place there. We'll have to wait and see.
That's what Bernie wanted here. It hasn't quite happened here either.
Yeah.
But I mean, it must be in some ways disheartening to feel this hope swell up in so many instances. When Batista was overthrown, for example, there were many of us who felt Cuba's going to be liberated and Cuba's going to be, a socialist, idyllic place to live and utopia and so forth. And it turned out, that Castro may have killed more people than Batista ever killed and certainly oppressed more.
That could be true. But, look at the big picture, the longue durée, as they say. We did end slavery. We do have in much of the world, countries where women can vote. That didn't used to be the case. I think we have made some progress in the United States and in many other countries, despite all the awful things that are going on right now. And I think Trump's going to run into some resistance if he tries to undo it all.
Do you think really that he's going to try to undo it all and seek this kind of retribution? How do you read that?
Well, retribution, revenge for him is tremendously important, and he certainly will try to do all that he can.
It's already after Liz Cheney, for example, it looks like, doesn't it?
Yeah. But we do still have a more or less functioning legal system. And I think it's not going to be that easy to completely undo it. Yes, you can appoint terrible people to be attorney general and U.S. attorneys around the country and so on, and they can do a lot of damage. But it's going to be hard to undo the whole system, especially to undo it in 4 years. And I think we're also going to see some squabbling and fighting within the people around him. I don't think they're all going to be united on this score. I do think we'll see some Republican senators resisting these appointments. We just saw 38 members of the House not go along with what Trump and Musk wanted them to do on the budget bill. So I'm hoping for some quarreling among thieves here. I may be too optimistic, but I'm sure there'll be some of it. There certainly was in his first term.
Yeah, I was just wondering about your feelings about the Supreme Court, though, since they've kind of extended immunity to him and seem to be pretty much going along with much of his vision of things.
I think it's the worst Supreme Court in a couple of generations. And I don't see any hope of changing that right away. But again, looking on the optimistic side, remember that slightly more than half of the lower court judges, federal judges, have been appointed by Democrats. And it's going to take a lot of cases quite a while to work their way up to the Supreme Court. And I don't know. It's not going to be easy to overturn the entire legal system of the United States.
Well, you mentioned that your own experience in the Congo has been disappointing, and particularly in terms of still seeing remnants and more than remnants of the ghost of Leopold, perhaps, haunting that nation. Are we going to be haunted for a long time by Donald J. Trump?
I think in some ways we will. But remember, we did throw him out after the first term. Had a very different kind of president. I don't think he was different enough in terms of being able to change the economy in this country and who it benefits. But I don't think Americans will let go of democracy as easily as, say, the German people did in 1933. There's so much talk now about, is this a moment like January 1933 in Germany, where Hitler took over, and that was the end of elections and democracy and freedom of speech for the next dozen years. There are some comparisons to that moment we can make. Big German industrialists and businessmen went and kissed the ring just the way, Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg are going to Mar-a-Lago. But we have a very strong federal system, which Germany did not have. One of the first things Hitler did, incidentally, was to dissolve all German state legislatures. Trump does not have the power to do that. And I think couldn't even come close to it. I think we have a better, stronger court system for all its disadvantages, and despite the Neanderthals on the Supreme Court. We've also lived for more than 2 centuries under a constitution. It's a far from perfect constitution. It's been tested in many ways. It's been improved in a few ways. It's still got immense problems with it. But I don't think the American people are going to give it up so easily.
I wonder what your thoughts are also on the fact that Germany has changed now in terms of leadership. France looks like it's going in a different direction entirely. Italy has been influenced by what some see as more of a right-wing and in some ways more successful right-wing hegemony. And Europe is, the face of Europe politically is changing immensely.
It is, and it's ominous. And there are, these similar currents in other parts of the world. The flood of immigration and refugees there and one of the things that produced it, I think the instability that people feel about their economic role in life because of globalization, with jobs being able to easily migrate overseas, is another factor. But, we're not alone in this country in experiencing the upheavals that are represented by Trump. And I worry about that a lot.
Well, as you've expressed to us here in this podcast, there's much to worry about, but also I see glimmers of hope in our conversation and things that you have lighted upon. And I thank you for, as usual, the kind of wisdom and perspicacity that comes from always any conversation I've had with you and the writing that you've done. Let me also thank all who joined us for this episode. And you can hear us, of course, on Apple and Spotify, and go to our website at graymatter.show. And if you haven't yet become a member of the podcast, I invite you to join us by going to our website at graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And I want to thank our great team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, Tanya, and Lori, and a special thanks to this week's guest, who, as I say, I always enjoy talking with, Adam Hochschild. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.